Hello everyone, Hafsa here. Since the beginning of the animation sections, we've been working on the mechanics of how everything moves and what things we can animate. Starting from this lesson, we're going to learn how to actually use them in cinematic animation. And by this I mean how to make your animation more interesting than a single character movement and actually create narrative and energy between cuts and shots using the principles that we've learned to create the actual movement, as well as some guidelines and additional techniques that will let you actually play around with your perspective, camera, and editing to create more interesting and better looking stories using animation. So, the most important thing when creating cinematic animation is remembering the placement of your camera, because different shots will use different angles and different type of lenses, in quotes, to show these effects, and you'll need to know how to animate parts of an object from different angles with different perspectives in order to pull certain effects and camera movements off. This is actually where good drawing abilities start to become important, but don't worry, because what is really important is to make sure that you understand how perspective works with a camera and the properties of your object, same as we've done with the animation before. When animating in 3D space, the same rules that we've been using for our animation so far are still going to apply, and they will still be working the exact same way in almost any type of shot. Just because you suddenly only see just part of the character body or look on the character from a different angle doesn't mean that the laws of reality stop working. Acceleration is still going to be conveyed by the speed and spacing between frames. Smear frames, impact frames, and overshoot are still going to be useful tools. The only difference is that now you need to consider not only how the rules of reality are going to affect your movement, but also how the camera captures images. The main rule regarding animation in 3D space is that objects that are close to the camera are big, while objects that are far from the camera are small. This creates a clear indication of distance from the camera. This trick relies solely on the audience experience with reality, because we can recognize that objects that might take the same amount of space on the screen are not necessarily the same size, and only seem like they are because their distance from the camera in the environment is different. The complication starts when your objects are moving forwards and away from the camera. Although on a 2D space an object will move in constant distance between frames, the amount of change in the size of an object on 3D axis is not constant. The closer an object is getting to the camera, the quicker it's going to grow, and the more intense the smear frames are going to get. This effect is caused by the aforementioned change in size relative to the object distance from the camera, and the way that in animation we depict speed through spacing. For example, let's look at this lever. From the side, we can see that it has its own changes in acceleration, but both ball and handle move at the same rotational speed at any given moment. We know that the lever and the ball have the same rotational speed, even when we look at the lever from the front. Because they are connected, they technically move at the same rotational speed. But now we have to accommodate for perspective. And because the lever is a straight line, the point closer to the camera is bigger and has to move with bigger spacing to stay connected to the rest of the lever. Now, if we look at each point on the movement separately, they look like they are moving in different speeds. A change in speed indicates acceleration. And this demonstration shows us that even though in reality we know that the object is moving in constant speed, to correctly depict it through the eyes of the camera, we'll have to artificially accelerate it to accommodate when objects are moving closer and further away from it. To simplify, objects close to the camera change size and move quickly, while objects further away from the camera will change size and speed more slowly. The type of shot and camera you're working with is going to affect the way that we're going to deform and accelerate your character. In real life, different types of cameras give you different focus range and fields of view. There are physical limitations to how focused or wide a shot can be without changing different cameras. In animation, we don't have this problem, but we do have to be conscious as to how you would realistically recreate the certain camera effect that we're trying to imitate. Going back to our first animation lesson, we've talked about how the camera's low frame rate result in motion blur when trying to take a picture of moving objects in real life. In the same way, the camera lens is going to affect the way that it captures pictures and how it deforms them. In general, your camera position creates the perspective in the scene, and different angles create different perspective points, like we've seen in the background design lessons. Your character is going to be affected by that perspective, so you're going to have to draw it with this perspective grid in mind, even if you don't have it as actual reference. This change in your character perspective is going to be expressed by the deformation of the character and basically changing its proportions to fit with this new perspective. And the term for this change in proportions of different body parts is called foreshortening. So foreshortening is the term used when viewing an object from an angle which doesn't allow you to see all of it at once, results in parts of it being hidden and their shape changed. It can appear in both neutral angles depending on your pose, or as a natural consequence of your camera angle. There are many techniques for foreshortening, and a big part of practicing is understanding how to make foreshortening look good. But foreshortening is not that hard to do if you understand the idea behind it. First, divide your object into simple shapes such as spheres and cubes, like we've been doing up until now. Now try and squish them in your mind in according to the movement that you want to create, and the more squished they are, the more they're going to be hidden, and the more front-facing they're going to seem. Now remember that when you are squishing them, you need to make sure that your curves or your angles are being kept correctly, so don't distort and flatten your volumes. Now factor in the way that objects that are closer to the camera are bigger and accelerate more quickly, and slowly increase the size and distance of the parts closer to the camera. Remember that when the object is far away from the camera, this change is very small, to the point of it being almost unnoticeable. So don't enlarge part of your character for no reason. In cases that your character is extremely close to the camera and you can only see parts of it, use the perspective points in your background as a reference as to how to actually deform and change the shape of the different body parts. because they too will obey the perspective rules of your scene. Now that you know the concept of acceleration towards camera and a little bit more about foreshortening and how you can create different perspectives using it, it's time to see how we combine the two and creating different camera effects and angles. Starting with the most extreme example, we have the biggest distortion in perspective and foreshortening with a fisheye camera. A fisheye lens will make everything captured by it distorted. You will find this effect in somewhat specialized scenes, such as from the point of view of a character looking out of an eye hole, or creating unsettling atmosphere, or sometimes to show a large amount of details that would usually not be able to fit in a single composition, like details behind the corner or in very distant places from each other. This type of camera lens corresponds to a 4-point perspective, which we haven't actually covered because it's very specialized and it doesn't really correspond to an actual grid which is available on Procreate. A 4-point perspective basically just creates a sphere. So once you create your background, which is slightly distorted as a background layout, you just need to use the background itself with its distortion to know how you're going to adjust and deform your character proportions and perspective in your animation. Of course, the timing and motion rules are going to work as usual, so you're still going to have ease in and ease out, but you're also going to have the added rule of acceleration towards camera. So stuff that is closer to the camera is going to be both less distorted and move quickly, meaning that you're going to get a lot of distortion within each part of your character's body, depending on their motion and their position within the fisheye perspective. The next type of lens is extreme shots. These can be shots from very high or low angles. And in these cases, your character model will be deformed to mimic a 3-point perspective, with the perspective points being on the side furthest away from the camera. So if you have a low angle shot, the perspective point will be at the head of the character. And if you have a high angle shot, your perspective point is going to be at the feet of your character. It's important to make sure that your character perspective actually fits with the background itself, so you don't just make a 3-point perspective specifically for your camera, it needs to match the background as well. And in these types of scenes, your animation is again going to abide by the rules of animations that we've seen before, and the rule of acceleration forwards camera. In these types of shots, your character is actually going to work very similarly to the liver example that we had at the last section. This type of shot is slightly difficult because the character model itself is going to be deformed and its moving parts of it are going to constantly change their size depending on their position in relation to the camera. So you're going to have to use a lot of foreshortening and different types of foreshortening depending on each individual frame. When trying to make a movement in an extreme angle, I usually break the character into simplified shapes in accordance to our character sheet and just compare their relative size to the other body parts to make sure that the character model stays consistent even with a difficult angle. Basically, instead of using a grid and trying to match the character to a single point or triple points, I just match each individual part of it to the rest of the body within that angle. Because you will encounter a lot of different parts being affected differently depending on their distance from the camera as well. So you can't only refer to your perspective points, even if you do have a grid. You need to remember acceleration towards camera, and that you need to exaggerate your foreshortening as well. So basically, in shots like this, it's better if you make it feel like it's correct instead of actually drawing it correctly. If your movement is too complicated or if you don't have the time to set up your grids. Moving slightly away from the extreme shots, we have more neutral shots where the object is extremely close to the camera. These are going to be close-up shots or shots that have a lot of movement made by the character itself. These types of shots function similarly to the extreme angle shots, but they are slightly easier to manage because you basically have two different perspectives. One, where your character is a little bit further away from the camera, where they're going to be on model without any deformation. And the other is the frames or body parts that are close to the camera, where we're going to use the same type of foreshortening as the extreme angle version, but again with a pretty easy perspective point, because we have a more neutral scene. So the amount of deformation that you're going to give to each body part is going to be lesser than in your extreme angle shots. Of shot is pretty common and tends to be very dynamic, even without using the crutches of extreme angle to give more variety to your animation. These type of shots are actually very versatile as well, because you can have both objects that are on model and stay the same distance from the camera, as well as more dynamic shots and poses that you can have when putting your character or object closer to the camera. And within this type of range from the camera, your shots are going to work in very similar way. In general, as long as your object stays in the same distance from the camera, it will keep its size and shape and move according to the rules that we've learned in our previous lessons. But once your object moves closer to the camera, its size and deformation will change in accordance to the concept of acceleration towards camera that we've seen at the beginning of the lesson. So it's going to accelerate very slowly and in an almost unnoticeable way when it's further away, and when close to the camera, it's going to move very quickly, and the trajectory of the object will change in accordance with the perspective rules of the scene. When animating complicated objects in space, at the beginning it's easier to break them down to shapes, sizes, and poses, or even plan their trajectories in advance, and later on use experience to understand your timing and placement better. It's also easier to break the different parts of your character depending on their distance from the camera. Basically, you can separate each part of your character into a different layer of sorts, and then animate the layer which is further away from the camera very easily with the rules that we've learned until now, and then animate the parts that are closer to the camera with the rule of acceleration so that you don't have to consider the entire body and how it's going to accelerate, and only focus on the relevant part. The last type of shots that we're going to have is where you see the full body of your character and it's moving in a somewhat 3D environment. This is 3D movement in a wide angle shot. In this type of shots, your character proportions and model will stay without any type of deformation. And only your character size will change relative to the camera, and of course the pose of your character is going to be made with foreshortening. In this type of shots, because you have a wide angle and you see your entire background, it's very easy to make your character fit the perspective using perspective point. Up until now, it was harder to do because the perspective point weren't necessarily present on the screen, or that different parts of your character had different perspectives depending on their distance from the camera. But with this type of scene, you can basically mark the effective and correct range for your character movement using the perspective points themselves. Also, you can basically use the background itself as a reference to the size of your character. If you have a grid, it's pretty easy. You just compare your character size to the grid on the ground or the sky, and just match your character's relative size to the background if you're bringing it closer or further away. But if you don't have a grid, you can just do that with comparison of simple textures or details within your background itself. It's going to be a little bit less precise, so using your perspective points to have your effective range is going to be helpful as well. Now, an important thing to remember when deciding when to use your foreshortening and acceleration and how to plan your shot is to understand if your perspective change stems from your character moving or from your camera moving. Even though we don't use actual 3D models and we don't have 3D environments, that doesn't mean that we can't have 3D animation using 2D. It just requires a different understanding of angles and specialized backgrounds. And knowing when your character is moving or when your camera is moving is going to be a big distinction on how you're going to approach your background and character movement. Basically, if your character is the one who's moving, we don't necessarily need to think of your background as a 3D environment. Only the individual parts of your character, which come closer or further away from the camera, are going to indicate the perspective change because of the relative size of each other and the deformation that we're going to use with foreshortening. With this type of shot, your background can stay basic and have singular perspective or any other type of perspective that you want, but they still stay consistent and don't change perspective in the middle. Only the individual parts of your character and its relative size changes. But when you want to animate your camera moving, this is where things become more interesting. If you're moving your camera, you're basically trying to create a 3D effect using 2D. You will see this with shots where the perspective changes or when using rotation shots. And the main difference between animating your character with regular shot but with your character moving in 3D space, as opposed to actually animating camera movement in 3D space, is how we're going to treat the relative sizes of your character's body part and the layout of the background. So I'll be covering the background in the next lesson of camera movement, but to animate your character to look like it's moving in 3D space with the camera is a little bit more difficult, because basically what you're doing is shifting the perspective points within your scene, which changes your character perspective for each individual frame. This is basically just having a whole bunch of extreme angle shots and connecting them together with a regular angle shot in the middle. So it's a combination of the more difficult parts of each type of shot. And to make them, we will use the same type of tricks that we do with the regular extreme angle shots. The important thing to remember when trying to animate your camera movement is that your character as a whole is going to be affected. So it means that each individual part is going to move separately depending on your character action, and that the entire character's position and perspective is going to change to fit the camera. So you will often see instances where some parts of your character are deformed due to the perspective, and are doubly deformed due to the action depending on their distance from the camera. And to do this type of shots, basically you can only rely on experience, where you want to accelerate different parts of your character, and on your understanding of your character model, where you want to change the perspective. So again, I recommend breaking your character into simplified objects and parts, and then doubly breaking your entire animation into layers depending on the distance of the object from the camera. I also recommend using a lot of frames when planning your animation. So even if you're going with a pose-to-pose method and then filling in the gaps using is in and is out and in-betweens, it's still better to have a lot of initial poses just so you know that your perspective is going to work without going back and forth and fixing many things. Because you weren't sure how to connect between poses that had a lot of change to them, like you're going to see with these type of shots. I myself almost always do them in the straight ahead method when creating my own projects, because it's easier to figure out the perspective and the connections between each frame with the higher amount of base frames. It is also very important to know how to animate and draw your character from any angle and position possible if you want to create 3D movement correctly. So it's important to properly understand your character model from every angle, especially when trying for different angles and camera movements which combine different techniques. Always try and refer to your character sheet to make sure you're keeping your character proportions in check. But don't be afraid to use a lot of foreshortening and deform your character model itself if it makes the movement itself clearer. Once you figure out and master how to recognize where your character is coming closer to the camera and how to animate it using foreshortening and keeping your character model, and how to recognize when your camera is moving and animate your character from the correct angle of the camera, you can combine the two and create the most complex type of animation, which is a combination of camera and character movement. Once you know how to do that, you can basically create any type of shots that you want, and matching your character to any type of 3D environment. When you are animating a combination of character and camera movement, you first need to recognize what type of movement your camera is making. See if you're working with a low angle, high angle, or mid-range shot. To determine your overall perspective, then determine the distance of the camera from your character to see which parts are going to be in the foreshortening range and which parts are going to be in the regular character model range. This is especially important if your character is also making action forward or away from the camera. So you need to understand what is the relative distance of each part of your character from the camera at each position of your camera, all the while keeping the perspective correct. Extra difficulty is added if your camera is also rotating or if your character is rotating, because then you really need to keep in mind the volumes and correct placement of details on your character. These are a lot of things to keep in mind, but we're going to use the same techniques that we've done up until now, just in combination. So you need to determine your perspective point, divide your characters into simple shapes and enlarge them and deform them according to foreshortening. And you need to keep your character on model by comparing the different body parts to themselves in relation to their proportions within the character design. There's nothing new or more complicated with this type of shots, except for the part that you need to combine all the techniques together. If you have enough practice in each individual one, it's not going to be very difficult for you to actually make this type of connections between them. The exercise for this lesson is to follow along the example I gave and try and create your own variations with them. You can either choose different camera angles, or you can use your own animations from the previous exercises as reference and try and animate them in different angles and perspectives. Again, make sure that you keep your line quality and character volumes and proportions consistent, and that you have an example of at least one angle perspective of movement that I've demonstrated throughout this video. Because this will basically mean that you have to create the animation from scratch and not based on something that you've made before, you can either choose to animate your character with or without the details. But of course, adding the details will add to the difficulty, so it's better for experienced animators. For a high difficulty exercise, just try and create the most dynamic movement that you can imagine, where both your character and your camera are moving in 3D space, while combining both full and part body shots. Basically, create a very dynamic action sequence as a one-shot. So don't use any cuts and just use camera movement. To recap, today we've learned about the effect that your camera will have on the deformation of your character, how the distance of your object relative to the camera affects the timing of your movement, and how foreshortening can be used to show different angles and poses of your character. We've also learned about the idea of acceleration towards camera, and what type of deformation and change in size we can expect from different types of shots, and when and how we use relative sizes of your character details to create the perspective of your character, as opposed to when we use background grids and perspective grids to determine the size of your character. Next lesson, we're going to learn about actually creating the camera movements that fit to your new perspectives and gives you the ability to make cinematic animation. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!